Without him, his thoughts flicker like a dying light, and he has no idea when they'll stop for good. I remember the moment I stopped being a man, though I cannot recall when I became something else entirely. My name was Harlan Dex, and I was guilty of misallocating 3,000 tons of promethium across 14 cycles, a crime I committed through exhaustion rather than malice. Though the administratum cared nothing for the distinction between the two, the tribunal lasted 11 minutes. The verdict arrived in 9 words: sentence to be carried out immediately. No appeals permitted under subsection 47. I stood in that grey chamber with my hands bound behind my back, listening to the words that ended my life without ending my breath, and I felt something inside me collapse like a structure whose foundation had been quietly removed over years of unnoticed erosion. The arbiter never looked at me. His eyes remained fixed on the data slate before him, reading my fate with the same inflection he might use to catalogue grain shipments or requisition forms. When the enforcers led me away, I tried to speak, to protest, to explain that I had worked 32 years without incident, that my record was clean, that I had a daughter in the lower Habs who needed me. They did not strike me for speaking. They simply continued walking as though I had made no sound at all. The holding cells smelled of old fear and industrial solvent. I sat on the metal bench and stared at my hands, still calloused from decades of labor, still bearing the scars from 100 small accidents that seemed important when they happened. A man in the adjacent cell whispered prayers to the Emperor through the wall, his voice cracking with desperation. I did not pray. I had seen what happened to those who prayed in the manufactorums when the machines failed, when the quotas went unmet, when the overseers grew impatient with explanations. Prayer changed nothing. It simply made the silence afterward more profound. They came for me before dawn, though dawn meant nothing in the hive levels where I had spent my entire life, where light came from flickering lumens and dying glow strips rather than any sun. The Medicae servitors who escorted me moved with a mechanical precision that I found unsettling even then, before I understood what I would become. Their faces were blank, expressionless, modified beyond recognition, or perhaps belonging to no one who had ever possessed a name worth remembering. I watched them as we walked through corridors that grew progressively colder, noting the surgical tools grafted where hands should have been, the augmetic eyes that tracked movement without curiosity or acknowledgement. One of them had a mouth sewn shut with crude stitching that had long since scarred over. I wondered if he had screamed during the procedure, if anyone had heard, if it mattered. The conversion facility occupied 3 sub-levels beneath the primary manufactorum district, a space I had passed 1,000 times without considering what occurred behind those sealed bulkheads. The air tasted of counterseptic and ozone. The walls were painted the same institutional grey as every other imperial structure I had ever known, marked with high Gothic script that proclaimed the Emperor's dominion over flesh and machine alike. We descended through checkpoints where servitors scanned my ident chip and recorded my passage with motions that suggested routine rather than purpose. No one spoke. The only sounds were footsteps echoing against plasteel and the distant hum of machinery that never ceased, that would continue long after I had forgotten the sound of my own voice. They placed me in a preparation chamber that smelled strongly of chemical disinfectant. A tech priest entered, his red robes immaculate, his face hidden behind a silver mask, etched with symbols I recognized, but could not read. He spoke in lingua technis to his attendants, never addressing me directly, never acknowledging that I stood before him as anything other than raw material awaiting processing. The attendants were servitors themselves, I realized, watching them move with that distinctive lack of hesitation that marked all autonomous functions. One approached with a scanner that hummed as it passed over my body. The readout displayed on a nearby screen showed my vitals, my biometric data, a schematic of my internal organs rendered in cold blue light. I was already being reduced to components, assessed not for who I was, but for what parts could be salvaged, what functions I could fulfill once properly modified. The tech priest finally looked at me, or rather, looked toward me, his augmetic eyes whirring as they adjusted focus. He spoke in low Gothic, his voice rendered metallic through a Vox implant embedded in his throat. Conversion classification Beta 7. Cognitive retention protocol Epsilon. You will serve in heavy labor designation. The Omnissiah provides purpose where flesh has failed. I opened my mouth to respond, to ask what cognitive retention meant, but one of the Servitor attendants stepped forward and pressed an injector against my neck before I could form words. The chemical rush was immediate and overwhelming, a sensation like falling through ice-cold water while simultaneously burning from within. My legs weakened. The room tilted. I tried to reach for something to steady myself and found my arms would not respond to my commands. The servitors caught me with practiced efficiency, lowering me onto a gurney that appeared from somewhere I had not noticed. The ceiling passed overhead in panels of fluorescent white as they wheeled me deeper into the facility. I could still see, still hear, still process what was happening, but my body had become separate from my will, a thing that existed adjacent to my consciousness rather than under its control. The surgical theater was brighter than I expected, almost painfully so after the dim corridors. I could see the apparatus suspended from the ceiling, mechanical arms ending in saws and drills and instruments I could not identify, all waiting with patient inevitability. The gurney locked into position beneath them with a metallic clang that resonated through my paralyzed body. Restraints deployed automatically, securing my limbs and torso and head with a thoroughness that suggested I was not the first to occupy this exact position. The tech priest appeared in my limited field of vision, flanked by two more attendants whose faces I could not see. He made adjustments to a control panel, his fingers moving across the input keys with a speed that blurred their individual motions. Subject demonstrates standard fear response, adrenaline levels elevated but manageable. Proceeding with minimal anesthetic protocol as per Cost Reduction Directive 7-7 Alpha. Consciousness retention calculated at 73% probability through primary augmentation phase. Acceptable parameters. The words took several seconds to penetrate the chemical fog in my mind. Minimal anesthetic, consciousness retention. I tried to move, to thrash against the restraints, to do anything that might delay or prevent what was about to occur, but the paralytic held me absolutely still. Only my eyes could move, tracking the mechanical arms as they descended with the slow deliberation of a predator that knows its prey cannot escape. The first incision was made along my right shoulder, and I felt it, a bright line of agony that my paralyzed body could not express through movement or sound. My mind screamed, but my throat produced nothing, not even the smallest whimper. They worked with efficiency that suggested extensive practice. The mechanical arms cut and peeled and removed with a precision no human hand could match. I felt my shoulder being opened, felt the separation of muscle from bone, felt the insertion of the first augmetic coupling as it was bolted directly into my skeleton with a grinding sensation that filled my entire awareness. The pain was extraordinary, absolute, a thing that occupied every corner of consciousness and left no room for thought or prayer or hope. Time lost meaning. I existed in an eternal present tense of surgical modification, each new procedure erasing any memory of the previous one through the sheer, overwhelming nature of sensation. But I remained aware. That was the horror the tech priest had catalogued so clinically. I was conscious through the entire process, unable to move or scream or beg, forced to experience every moment of my transformation from man to tool. They removed my right arm entirely, replacing it with a crude mechanical limb designed for heavy lifting rather than fine manipulation. The augmetic hand that terminated it possessed only 3 digits, thick and blocky, controlled by nerve inputs that burned as they were spliced into my spinal column. My left arm received similar modification, though they left more of the original flesh intact, perhaps determining that full replacement was unnecessary for my designated function. My legs were augmented with reinforced joints and synthetic muscle cables that increased load-bearing capacity while eliminating any grace or fluidity of movement. I would walk with the distinctive servo-assisted gait of all labor servitors, a lurching stride that prioritized stability over speed. The cranial modification came last. I felt the drill entering my skull above my right ear, boring through bone with a high-pitched whine that I could hear through the conduction of my own skeleton. The pain transcended anything I had experienced before, a violation so profound that something in my mind simply withdrew, retreating to a space where sensation could not follow. I floated in that space, observing what was happening to my body from a distance that felt safe, protected, merciful. They inserted the cortical control unit directly into my brain, a device designed to interface with my motor functions and override my voluntary control when necessary. I felt it spreading through my gray matter like roots seeking purchase in soil, establishing connections that would allow external commands to bypass my conscious will entirely. And yet I remained. When the surgery concluded, when the tech priest spoke the final benedictions to the Omnissiah and withdrew with his attendants, when the mechanical arms retracted into their ceiling housings and the lights dimmed to a level that no longer seared my vision, I found that I could still think. The thoughts were slower, more labored, as though moving through some thick medium that impeded their flow, but they existed. I knew who I was. I remembered my name. I recalled my crime and my sentence. The awareness brought no comfort, only a dawning realization that my punishment had not ended with the surgery, but had merely transitioned into a new and more terrible phase. Recovery occurred in a holding bay, where dozens of newly converted servitors stood in rows, receiving final programming adjustments and behavioral conditioning. I stood among them, my body responding to commands I did not consciously give, turning when instructed, raising my arms for inspection, walking in predetermined patterns that tested my modified musculature and balance. A tech adept moved through the rows with a data slate, noting serial numbers and performance metrics, never once looking at faces or acknowledging that the servitors before him had once been people. I tried to speak, to call out to him, to make him understand that I was still present inside this modified shell, but my vocal cords had been altered during the surgery, reduced to a functionality that could only produce simple vocalizations for warning alerts or status confirmations. The words I wanted to say remained trapped in my mind, unutterable. They assigned me to Manufactorum 7 Gamma, a massive industrial complex specializing in the production of artillery shells for the Departamento Munitorum. My function was simple. I would lift raw materials from supply conveyors and place them into processing machinery. I would stand at my station for 20-hour shifts with minimal rest periods. I would perform this task repeatedly until mechanical failure occurred or until my organic components degraded beyond functional capacity, whichever came first. The overseer who explained this to me did so with the same tone one might use to describe the operation of a pump or conveyor system. I was equipment now. My preferences and comfort were as relevant as those of any other tool in the facility. The work began immediately. I stood at my designated position, a painted square on the rockcrete floor that marked where my feet should remain positioned. The conveyor brought materials to me in an endless stream, 50-kilogram ingots of raw metal, crates of components requiring sorting, barrels of chemical compounds that sloshed with ominous liquidity. My augmetic arms lifted and moved and placed without conscious direction, guided by the cortical implant that translated command signals directly into motion. I was a passenger in my own body, watching my limbs perform their assigned functions while my mind remained separate, observing, unable to influence or alter what occurred. Hours passed. The shift continued without variation or respite. Around me, other servitors performed their own tasks with the same mechanical precision. None spoke, none paused. None exhibited any sign of awareness beyond the immediate requirements of their programming. I wondered if they were truly mindless, if the conversion process had successfully erased whatever consciousness they once possessed, or if they too retained some fragment of self that simply had no means of expression. The question was unbearable, because I could not know, would never know, would spend however long I remained functional uncertain whether my suffering was unique or universal. The first flicker came during hour 7 of my initial shift. My vision grayed at the edges, narrowing to a tunnel that contained only my hands and the conveyor and the materials I was meant to move. My thoughts slowed further, becoming sluggish and indistinct, like words spoken underwater. For a span of time I could not measure. I simply performed my function without thinking about it, without remembering who I had been or understanding what I had become. I was the task. Nothing existed beyond the lifting and placing, the rhythm of motion that required no consciousness to execute. When awareness returned, when the grayness receded, and my thoughts clarified enough to recognize what had happened, I felt a terror so profound it had no words attached to it. I had vanished, not died, not fallen unconscious, simply ceased to exist as a thinking entity, while my body continued its labor uninterrupted. The realization that this could happen, that my awareness could switch off like a failing lumen and leave only the Servitor functioning in my place, filled me with a panic that my modified body could not express through trembling or rapid breathing or any other physical manifestation. I stood at my station, lifting and placing, and screamed silently inside a skull that had become my prison. The flickers began occurring with increasing frequency. Sometimes they lasted seconds, sometimes minutes. Sometimes I could not determine their duration because the experience of returning to consciousness carried no indication of how long I had been absent. I learned to recognize the warning signs, a certain quality of mental fog that preceded total dissolution, a sensation like my thoughts spreading too thin across too much space, a feeling that I was being diluted in some vast emptiness until nothing remained but routine and reflex. When I noticed these signs, I would try to focus, to concentrate on some detail or memory that might anchor me to continued awareness. But the effort seemed to accelerate the process rather than prevent it. The harder I struggled to remain present, the faster I faded. Days accumulated, though I could not count them with any accuracy. The manufactorum operated in continuous shifts, and my internal chronometer had been removed during surgery to save costs and reduce unnecessary cognitive load. I worked, and occasionally I existed, and the boundary between these states grew progressively less distinct. I began to forget things. Small details at first. The name of the street where I had lived, the color of my daughter's eyes, the taste of recaf in the morning before shift began. These memories did not depart dramatically. They simply failed to arrive when I reached for them, leaving blank spaces where certainty had once resided. I told myself that forgetting was natural, that anyone subjected to sensory deprivation and repetitive labor would experience similar deterioration, but I knew the truth was more sinister than simple degradation. The cortical implant was overwriting my neural pathways with operational data, replacing who I had been with what I was meant to do. I tried to resist. I rehearsed memories deliberately during moments of clarity, repeating them like catechisms in hope of preserving them through repetition. My daughter's name was Selene. She had dark hair. She worked in textile production on level 63. She was 17 standard years old. I loved her more than anything in the Imperium. These facts became my anchor, the core around which I attempted to maintain identity. But each flicker eroded them slightly. Details became uncertain. Had her hair been dark or merely darker than mine? Was she 17 or 18? Did she work in textiles or assembly? The memories remained, but their clarity diminished, like documents that had been copied too many times, each iteration losing fidelity until only vague shapes remained. The other servitors never acknowledged me. I worked alongside them, our augmetic limbs moving in synchronized patterns that suggested choreography. But we might as well have been separated by void shields for all the connection that existed between us. I studied them during my aware moments, searching for any sign that they too retained consciousness, that I was not alone in this particular damnation. Most showed nothing. Their faces were blank or modified beyond expression. Their movements contained no hesitation or variation that might suggest internal deliberation. But occasionally, very occasionally, I would notice something. A servitor who paused for a fraction of a second before resuming its task. Another whose eyes tracked movement in a way that seemed almost curious. A third who made a sound that might have been a sigh if such things were possible for the mechanically augmented. These observations provided no comfort. If anything, they deepened my horror, because they suggested that consciousness might persist in many servitors, trapped and silent and utterly incapable of reaching across the void that separated each isolated awareness from all others. We were a crowd of the damned, working within arm's reach of one another, while experiencing absolute solitude. I wanted to believe that I was unique, that some error in my conversion had left me partially functional where others had been properly erased, but I could not sustain that delusion. The tech priest's words echoed in the fragments of memory I still possessed. Cognitive retention protocol Epsilon. Consciousness retention calculated at 73% probability. They had known this would happen. They had designed it to happen. The cost-saving directive meant they used minimal anesthetic and preservation procedures, accepting that some subjects would retain awareness because the alternative, ensuring complete dissolution, required more expensive techniques. I was not a mistake. I was functioning exactly as intended. The work continued without variation. Lift, place, return, wait, repeat. My augmetic arms never tired, never cramped, never required the small adjustments and rest positions that human limbs demanded. They simply operated at maximum efficiency until material supply ceased or until programmed rest periods arrived. During these rest periods, we stood in our assigned positions, unmoving, waiting for the next shift to commence. Some servitors powered down entirely, their consciousness, if any remained, disappearing into something like sleep. I could not. My mind remained active during these intervals, trapped in absolute stillness while thoughts circled endlessly through the same worn channels. I began to understand why servitors were positioned as they were throughout the Imperium, not simply for function, though function was paramount, but for horror. We were warnings rendered in flesh and metal. Every citizen who saw us working understood implicitly what awaited criminals, heretics, failures, the unfortunate. We were the Imperium's answer to the question of what became of those who transgressed or disappointed or simply occupied space that could be better utilized. We were efficient, obedient, inexhaustible, and we had once been human. That transformation, that reduction from person to instrument, served as a deterrent more effective than any execution could provide. Death ended suffering. Servitor conversion made it eternal. The first major flicker lasted an entire shift. I became aware again during the rest period, standing in my designated square with no memory of the previous 20 hours. The conveyor was still. The manufactorum lights had dimmed to night cycle settings. Around me, other servitors stood motionless, some with their heads bowed, others staring straight ahead at nothing. I tried to recall anything from the lost time and found only absence, a gap where experience should have resided. The panic this induced was overwhelming, a sensation of drowning in invisible water. I had lost an entire cycle of existence, and there was no way to know if this was the first such loss or simply the first I had noticed upon returning. How many other shifts had I missed? How much of my remaining consciousness had already been consumed by the flickers while I was too far gone to notice the transition? The thought that I might have been flickering in and out for days or weeks without any continuity of experience was unbearable. I might have already lived months in this state, experiencing only scattered moments of awareness, separated by vast gulfs of automated function. Each return to consciousness could be my first from my own perspective, with no way to distinguish it from previous returns or anticipate the next disappearance. Time became meaningless. I existed in isolated fragments, like pages torn from a book and scattered, each one readable but bearing no reliable connection to those that came before or after. A new servitor appeared at the station beside mine several cycles later, or what I perceived as several cycles later, though I could no longer trust my perception of duration. It was a recent conversion, the surgical scars still livid against grey flesh, the augmetic components still bearing the dull sheen of new manufacture rather than the accumulated grime of extended service. I watched it take position and begin its assigned task, lifting components from a different conveyor and feeding them into a processing unit that stamped them with identification codes. Its movements were uncertain at first, slightly mistimed, suggesting the cortical implant was still calibrating to its new host. The servitor's face was visible, unmodified except for the control ports installed behind each ear. It was a woman, or had been, middle-aged, with features that might have been kind before fear and surgery had reshaped them into a mask of blank endurance. I tried to catch her attention, to make some gesture or sound that might communicate my awareness, my sympathy, my shared horror. But my body would not respond to these intentions. The cortical implant permitted only task-relevant actions. Attempting to override it felt like trying to move a limb that had fallen asleep, the commands arriving at their destination but producing no result. I could only watch as she worked, as her movements became progressively smoother and more efficient, as the uncertainty in her motions disappeared beneath the growing influence of her programming. 3 shifts later, her eyes were empty. Whatever awareness she might have retained initially had either receded beyond any surface expression or had been successfully overwritten by her cortical conditioning. She worked with the same mechanical precision as every other servitor in the facility, exhibiting no sign of internal experience. I grieved for her, though I could not articulate why. Perhaps because her visible dissolution suggested what awaited me. Perhaps because I had hoped to find companionship in shared suffering and had instead watched that possibility erased before it could manifest. Perhaps simply because she had been human and now was not, and I had witnessed the transition without being able to prevent or even acknowledge it. The flickers grew longer and more frequent. I would begin a shift with full awareness and find myself returning to consciousness near its end, having lost hours to automated function. The gaps in my continuity became my new reality, brief islands of thought separated by oceans of unconscious labor. I stopped trying to count the cycles or track my deterioration. The effort required more sustained focus than I could maintain. Instead, I simply existed when I could, observing my circumstances with a detachment that felt almost peaceful in its inevitability. I was dying by degrees, eroding like stone beneath constant water, and there was nothing to be done about it except experience the process, for as long as experience remained possible. During one period of awareness, I noticed my reflection in a polished section of machinery. The servitor looking back at me bore only passing resemblance to Harlan Dex. My face had thinned, the flesh receding as my modified metabolism consumed resources with brutal efficiency. My eyes had developed the same vacant quality I had observed in other servitors, a blankness that suggested no one was home, even when I knew, from my interior perspective, that someone still persisted. The augmetic limbs that protruded from my shoulders looked alien, grotesque, a violation of the human form that no amount of familiarity could normalize. I was becoming one of them, the shambling mechanical laborers I had seen throughout my life without ever truly considering their nature. The transformation was nearly complete. Only my awareness remained, and that was failing. I tried to remember my daughter's face and could not. The knowledge that I had a daughter persisted. The name Celine still arrived when I reached for it, but her features had dissolved into vagueness, a blur of half-recalled details that might have belonged to anyone or no one. I had lost her. She remained alive somewhere in the hive levels, perhaps still wondering what had become of me, perhaps having already moved forward with her life and relegated me to the category of the disappeared. But I had lost the ability to picture her, to hold her image in my mind with any clarity. This loss felt more profound than any physical modification. They had not simply taken my body, they were taking my past, my identity, everything that had made me a person rather than a function. The overseer appeared at my station during a rare moment of clarity. He was a thin man with augmetic eyes and a vox implant that made his voice sound metallic and distant. He consulted a data slate, comparing my serial number to some internal record, then nodded to himself. Unit 7 Gamma 493 demonstrates adequate performance metrics. No behavioral anomalies recorded. scheduled for continued service in current capacity pending mechanical evaluation at cycle 5000. He moved to the next servitor without waiting for any response, inspecting and cataloging with the efficiency of someone who had performed this task countless times. I wanted to scream at him, to make him understand that I was still present, still suffering, still human beneath the modifications and programming. But my vocal systems produced only the low status tone that indicated normal function. The overseer heard it, noted it on his data slate, and continued his rounds. To him, I was equipment. The tone confirmed operational status. Nothing else mattered. I began to wonder if I would recognize the final flicker when it came. Would there be any indication that the next gap in awareness would be permanent? Would I feel myself fading with unusual intensity, some final surge of consciousness before eternal dissolution? Or would it be indistinguishable from all the others, just another flicker that happened to extend forever, leaving me unaware that I had ceased to be aware? The uncertainty was its own torment. I could not prepare. I could not brace myself. I could only wait, experiencing each return to consciousness with the knowledge that it might be the last, that the next flicker might be the one from which I never emerged. The administratum had sentenced me to death, but they had made the dying last. Sometime during what might have been my 300th cycle or my 1000th, I cannot be certain, a malfunction occurred in the manufacturum's primary power distribution. The lights flickered, the conveyors stuttered to a halt, and for approximately 40 seconds, the entire facility fell into darkness and silence. In that silence, I heard something I had not heard since my conversion. I heard another servitor make a sound that was not a status tone or warning alert. It was a sob, brief and quickly suppressed, but unmistakable in its humanity. The sound came from somewhere to my left, from one of the servitors working the heavy press stations. I could not turn my head to look, could not move to investigate, but I knew what I had heard. Someone else was present. Someone else retained enough awareness to feel despair profound enough that it momentarily overrode their vocal conditioning. The knowledge that I was not alone in this should have provided comfort, but instead, it deepened my horror. We were many, perhaps hundreds throughout the facility, perhaps thousands across the hive, each one trapped in isolated awareness, suffering in parallel, but unable to communicate or provide comfort or even acknowledge each other's existence. The power returned. The conveyors resumed their motion. Work continued as though the interruption had never occurred. But I could not forget that sound, could not stop thinking about the person who had made it, wondering if they realized they had been heard, if they took any small comfort from having expressed something, anything that exceeded their programming. The sob haunted me through subsequent flickers, becoming a touchstone I could return to, proof that I had not imagined my own awareness, that the experience of consciousness persisting through conversion was real and shared and terrible. My efficiency ratings began to decline. The cortical implant compensated automatically, increasing signal strength to override my degrading neural responses. But the decline continued in measurable increments. I moved fractionally slower. I occasionally misplaced materials, my augmetic hands releasing them at incorrect coordinates. The mistakes were minor, within acceptable tolerance, but they represented deterioration that would eventually exceed those tolerances. I was wearing out, not mechanically but cognitively, my organic brain tissue breaking down under the sustained stress of conflict between my will and my programming. A tech priest arrived to perform diagnostics. He connected cables to the ports in my skull and ran tests that I experienced as strange sensations, colors and sounds that had no source, phantom touches across skin that no longer existed. He muttered in lingua technis to his servitor assistants, reviewing data that described my interior state in terms I could not understand. After approximately 15 minutes, he disconnected his equipment and made a notation on his data slate. Organic degradation proceeding within expected parameters. No intervention required until failure threshold achieved. Continue current assignment. He left without performing any repairs or adjustments. I was failing, and this was expected, acceptable, planned for. They had calculated how long servitors like me would last before our organic components degraded beyond usefulness. I was on schedule. The realization that my deterioration was not a flaw but a feature, that they had designed these systems knowing that consciousness might persist through its own dissolution, filled me with a rage that my body could not express. I wanted to strike the tech priest, to damage him as I had been damaged, to make him feel even a fraction of what I experienced every moment of my aware existence. But my augmetic arms continued their assigned tasks, lifting and placing, utterly indifferent to my internal fury. The flickers became my entire existence. I lived in the gaps between them, in the scattered moments when I could think and remember and suffer. The time I spent unconscious was no longer lost time, but rather the majority of my existence, the baseline state from which I occasionally emerged before inevitably returning. I was a ghost haunting my own body, appearing briefly before fading back into whatever void claimed me between appearances. The thought that this might continue for years, that I might flicker in and out until my organic components finally failed completely, was unbearable. But bearing it or not made no difference. It would continue regardless. I stopped trying to hold on to memories. The effort was futile. Each flicker took something, and what it took never fully returned. I forgot my age. I forgot what crime had brought me here, retaining only the vague knowledge that I had been judged and found wanting. I forgot the faces of people I had known, their names, their relationships to me. The memories did not depart cleanly. They degraded, becoming uncertain and confused, mixing with one another until I could not distinguish what had actually occurred from what I might have imagined or dreamed during the strange states between consciousness and automated function. But I remembered that I had been human. That core fact persisted even as everything else dissolved. I had been a person. I had possessed a name and a life and choices, however limited they might have been. I had felt things, wanted things, feared things that mattered to me for reasons I could no longer articulate. This knowledge was both anchor and torment, the last piece of my identity that refused to be overwritten, the fragment that ensured I would continue to suffer awareness even as I lost everything that made that awareness meaningful. A new assignment arrived during what I still thought of as my 800th cycle, though I had long since lost any reliable method of counting. The conveyor brought different materials, smaller components that required more precise placement. My augmetic hands were not designed for precision work. The task exceeded my specifications, but the manufactorum's scheduling systems had assigned it nonetheless, probably due to some shortage of appropriate servitors elsewhere in the facility. I attempted the work and failed, repeatedly placing components at incorrect angles or applying too much pressure and damaging them. An alarm sounded. Red lights began rotating above my station. An overseer arrived quickly, reviewed the situation, and spoke sharply into a Vox unit. Unit 77 Gamma 493 is malfunctioning, requesting maintenance servitor for evaluation and possible retirement. Retirement. The word penetrated my awareness with unusual clarity. Retirement meant deactivation, disassembly, the final end of function and consciousness alike. I felt something that might have been relief, or might have been terror. I could not distinguish between them. The prospect of cessation was both horrifying and welcome. An end to suffering that would also be an end to everything, including the small, stubborn part of me that still insisted on being Harlan Dex, despite having forgotten what that name meant. The maintenance servitor arrived, examined me with instruments I could not see clearly, then made adjustments to my cortical implant through the access ports in my skull. I felt something shift inside my head, a sensation like thoughts being forcibly realigned, like the channels through which consciousness flowed being redirected or constricted. The world grayed at the edges, but differently than during a flicker. This was permanent. I understood somehow, a reduction in my cognitive capacity that would not return when the gray receded. The servitor completed its work and withdrew. The overseer observed as I attempted the precision task again. This time, my hands moved with greater accuracy, guided by modified neural pathways that reduced my conscious involvement in their control. I succeeded in placing the components correctly. The alarm ceased. The overseer made a note on his data slate and moved on to other concerns. I had been repaired, my malfunction corrected through the simple expedient of reducing my awareness further, giving more control to the cortical implant and less to whatever remained of my original mind. I understood then that retirement was not inevitable. They would modify me repeatedly, reducing my consciousness incrementally, making me progressively less human and more machine until the distinction became purely academic. I would not die. I would simply fade by degrees, each adjustment claiming another portion of my awareness until nothing remained but automated response patterns that mimicked the appearance of basic cognition. This was worse than death. This was dissolution without end, a process that could continue indefinitely as long as my body remained physically functional. The flickers changed after the adjustment. They came more frequently but felt different, less like gaps in consciousness and more like dimming, as though someone was slowly lowering the intensity of my awareness without turning it off completely. I existed in twilight, neither fully present nor fully absent, experiencing my tasks as though from a great distance while simultaneously performing them with greater efficiency than before. The conflict between my will and my programming had been resolved, not through victory of either side, but through the elimination of the battlefield. There was progressively less of me to resist, less capability for internal conflict, less consciousness to experience suffering. This should have brought relief. Instead, it brought a new kind of horror. I was not dying. I was being carefully, methodically erased, and some part of me was aware enough to recognize the process, but not aware enough to feel the full weight of what was being lost. I grieved for myself while simultaneously forgetting what I was grieving for. The tragedy was not simply that I would cease to exist, but that I would not remember having existed, would not carry even the knowledge of loss into whatever diminished state awaited me. My hands moved with absolute precision now, placing components exactly as required, never hesitating, never making errors. I watched them work and felt nothing, no pride in accomplishment. No frustration at failure, no sensation of my own. The hands belonged to something that wore my body but was not me, or was me only in the technical sense that we shared the same physical space. The distinction was becoming meaningless. If I could not control my actions, could not feel connection to what my body did, in what sense was it still my body? In what sense was I still I? The manufactorum existed in a state of eternal sameness. The conveyors moved. The machinery processed, the servitors labored, nothing changed except by slow degradation or replacement. The materials we processed became shells that would be fired at enemies I would never see, contributing to wars I would never understand, serving an imperium that had reduced me to a tool for its perpetuation. The irony was almost funny. I had been guilty of misallocating promethium, a crime of inefficiency, and my punishment was to be converted into a being that could only be efficient, that had no capacity for the errors that had defined my humanity. They had made me perfect through mutilation. During one period of awareness, I noticed that I could no longer remember what fear felt like. I knew the word. I understood it as a concept. But the actual sensation, the tightness in the chest, the acceleration of heartbeat, the flood of adrenaline that had once accompanied danger or uncertainty, these had become abstract notions rather than lived experiences. My modified body did not produce fear responses. The cortical implant suppressed them as counterproductive to function. I could observe situations that should terrify me, like the massive press that could crush a servitor if they misstepped, and feel nothing but mild awareness of potential malfunction. This absence of fear was itself frightening, except I could not feel that meta-fear either. I could only observe it intellectually, recognizing that something important had been taken from me without being able to mourn its loss properly. I was becoming a thing that could analyze its own dissolution without experiencing appropriate emotional responses to that analysis. The gap between knowing and feeling had widened to an unbridgeable chasm. Time continued its passage, marked by shift changes and material quotas rather than any subjective experience of duration. I might have been a servitor for months or years or decades. My body showed wear but not age in any conventional sense. The augmetic components were periodically serviced and replaced. The organic portions were sustained by nutrient feeds and medical interventions I did not consciously experience. I could theoretically function for a very long time, long enough that the person I had been would be forgotten by everyone who had known him, long enough that even I would forget I had been that person. A new tech priest appeared at my station one cycle, younger than the others I had encountered, his augmentations less extensive. He studied me with what might have been curiosity, his organic eye focusing on my face, while his augmetic eye scanned my serial number and operational data. He spoke, not to me, but to himself, his voice carrying a note of something that resembled wonder. Fascinating. Theta wave patterns, suggesting sustained low-level consciousness despite epsilon protocol implementation. The organic component persists in generating self-referential cognition, even under cortical suppression. A statistical anomaly. Should not occur in more than 0.03% of conversions. He made additional scans, muttering observations in a mixture of high Gothic and lingua technis. I listened without fully comprehending, understanding only that my continued awareness was unusual, unintended, a flaw in the system that had somehow escaped correction. The tech priest seemed pleased by this discovery, as though he had found an interesting specimen for study. He departed eventually, leaving me with the knowledge that my suffering was not even normal, that most servitors presumably did not retain consciousness as I had, that I was damaged in a way that made my damnation unique. This knowledge helped nothing. If anything, it worsened my situation, because it meant no one was coming to fix me, to complete the erasure that should have already occurred. I was functioning within acceptable parameters despite the anomaly. The fact that I experienced my function as torture was irrelevant to those who monitored such things. I produced adequate output. I did not malfunction in ways that affected productivity. What occurred inside my skull was my own private catastrophe, invisible to any observer and therefore beneath notice. The flickers continued, but I had adapted to them, or they had adapted to me, and the distinction no longer seemed important. I existed in fragments, and this was simply how existence manifested for me now. I had no before to compare it to, no clear memory of continuous consciousness that might make my current state seem deficient. I simply was, intermittently. And between those moments of being, I did not exist in any way that mattered to me. The gaps were not sleep or unconsciousness, but rather absolute absence, voids in which I did not even not experience. My daughter's name came to me during a flicker, arriving fully formed as though it had never left. Selene. She had been important to me. I loved her. These facts existed in my mind with the clarity of catechism, absolute and unquestionable, but I could not remember her face or her voice or any specific moment we had shared. The love remained, an emotion without object, floating in my awareness like debris in an empty room. I tried to hold on to it, to use it as an anchor, but it slipped away as the flicker took me, and when I returned, the name was gone again, replaced by vague knowledge that someone, somewhere, had once mattered to me. A servitor at the adjacent station collapsed during a shift, its augmetic legs failing suddenly, sending it crashing to the floor with a sound that drew the attention of nearby overseers. They examined it briefly, determined it was beyond field repair, and summoned removal servitors to take it away for disassembly. As it was dragged past my station, its eyes moved, tracking me with an intensity that suggested awareness, and its mouth, unconstrained by the mechanical damage that had felled it, formed words I could not hear over the manufactorum's ambient noise. But I could see its lips moving, shaping a phrase it repeated several times before it was taken beyond my range of vision. I am still here. The words haunted me. They were my words, or could have been. The essential statement of my entire existence since conversion. I am still here, still present, still suffering, still aware despite all modifications and degradations and attempts to erase me. The other servitor had wanted me to know, or had needed to say it regardless of whether anyone heard, that it retained some fragment of self, even as its body failed and its service ended. I wondered if it had taken comfort from making that declaration, or if the comfort was only in my observation of it, in knowing that its final words had been witnessed and understood. The removal servitors would take it to disassembly, where its augmetic components would be reclaimed for future conversions, and its organic remains would be processed into nutrient paste or industrial feedstock. Nothing would be wasted. The Imperium was efficient in all things, but that person, whoever they had been before conversion, would be truly gone, their awareness finally extinguished after however long they had endured it. I envied them. They had reached the end. They would not flicker again. My work continued. The precision tasks eventually gave way to other assignments as the manufactorum's needs shifted. Heavy lifting, material sorting, chemical mixing under carefully programmed parameters. My augmetic body adapted to each new function with the flexibility of any tool, my cortical implant receiving updated instructions and implementing them without my conscious input. I was useful, I was efficient, I was everything the Imperium required of its servitors, and I was aware. That contradiction defined my existence. I was simultaneously a perfectly functioning tool and a suffering consciousness, two things occupying the same space without either being able to eliminate the other. The tool could not fully suppress the consciousness. The consciousness could not influence the tool. We coexisted in permanent conflict that neither side could win, locked together until mechanical failure or organic degradation finally provided the cessation that modification had made impossible. I began to notice patterns in my flickers. They occurred most frequently during repetitive tasks that required no variation or problem solving. They diminished during more complex operations that demanded some minimal cognitive engagement. This suggested that my awareness existed in inverse proportion to automaticity, that I was most present when most needed and most absent when least required. The cortical implant was efficient, using my consciousness only when it provided value and suppressing it otherwise. I was being treated as an expensive resource to be conserved, activated only when automation proved insufficient. This realization brought a strategy, desperate and probably futile, but the only one available to me. If complexity sustained awareness, then I needed to seek complexity, to volunteer for assignments that exceeded my specifications, to make mistakes that required conscious correction. The plan was flawed. I could not volunteer, could not choose my assignments, could not deliberately make mistakes without triggering malfunction protocols that would result in further modification. But I could pay attention when opportunities arose, could engage with tasks more deeply than required, could think about what I was doing even when thinking provided no functional benefit. The effort was exhausting in ways my modified body should not have been able to experience. Maintaining unnecessary consciousness felt like holding my breath, like forcing my eyes to stay open when they desperately wanted to close. But I persisted, because the alternative was fading entirely, and something in me still resisted that outcome, despite no longer remembering clearly why existence mattered or what I hoped to preserve by maintaining it. An alarm sounded in a distant section of the manufactorum, followed by shouts and the sound of heavy machinery grinding to a halt. The conveyors stopped. The servitors froze in position, awaiting new instructions. I stood with my arms extended, holding a component I had been in the process of moving, and I remained aware through the pause, watching as overseers ran toward the source of the alarm with expressions of concern. The pause extended into minutes. No one approached to provide new commands. We simply stood, an army of frozen figures, waiting. In the silence, I heard it again. A sob from somewhere nearby, quickly suppressed but unmistakable. Then another from a different direction. Then a sound that might have been a whimper or might have been a status warning, difficult to distinguish. The pause had created a gap in our programming, a moment where we were neither actively working nor explicitly powered down, and in that gap, Awareness bloomed across the facility like lights turning on in a darkened building. We were many. We were present. And for these few minutes, we existed without purpose, which was the closest thing to freedom we could experience. The moment ended. The conveyors resumed. New instructions arrived through our cortical implants, and we returned to our functions as though nothing had occurred. But I knew now, with absolute certainty, that I was not alone. The knowledge changed nothing about my circumstances. I remained trapped, isolated, unable to communicate or collaborate or provide comfort to any other sufferer. But I was not alone. The horror was universal. The damnation was shared. Every servitor I saw might be experiencing exactly what I experienced, might be just as aware and just as helpless and just as desperate for an end that would not come. This thought should have been comforting, but it was unbearable. My efficiency ratings stabilized at acceptable levels. I no longer made errors or exhibited performance degradation. The modifications had succeeded in optimizing my function. I was a successful conversion, a vindication of the administratum's cost-saving measures. The fact that consciousness persisted was irrelevant because it did not affect output. I could suffer indefinitely as long as I also produced indefinitely. The system had no incentive to end my awareness, and every incentive to maintain my function. I was trapped not by malice, but by efficiency, by a bureaucratic apparatus that measured value in productivity metrics and considered subjective experience beneath quantification. I stopped expecting rescue or cessation. They would not come. No one was monitoring my theta waves except as objects of academic curiosity. No one cared that I remained aware. The tech priests who serviced me saw only a functional unit operating within acceptable parameters. The overseers who supervised me saw only a tool performing its assigned tasks. I was invisible as a person, apparent only as a mechanism, and this invisibility was absolute and permanent. The work continued. Shifts blended into one another. I lifted and placed and sorted and processed, my augmetic limbs moving with perfect precision, my thoughts growing progressively simpler as more of my cognitive capacity was reallocated to motor control and task execution. I was being worn down, not through malfunction but through optimal use. Every moment of consciousness, consuming resources that could not be replenished. Every flicker eroding neural pathways that would never regenerate. I was approaching an asymptote, a state where I would be maximally functional and minimally aware, and that state was by design. A new servitor appeared at my station, replacing one that had been removed for reasons I did not witness. This one was different. Its modifications were more extensive, its augmetic components more integrated with its remaining organic tissue, but its eyes were alert, tracking movement with an intensity that suggested recent conversion. I recognized the look. I had seen it in reflections during my early cycles. This servitor was aware, fully and painfully aware, probably still remembering who it had been, still processing the horror of what it had become. I wanted to communicate with it, to provide some warning or comfort or acknowledgement, but I could not. My vocal systems remained locked to status tones. My body remained constrained to assigned functions. I could only watch as it began its work, as its movements grew smoother over subsequent shifts, as the awareness in its eyes gradually dimmed beneath the growing influence of its cortical conditioning. I was watching my own past, witnessing the process I had undergone, unable to intervene or alter the outcome. The servitor would fade, as I had faded, and eventually it would reach the state I now occupied, neither fully present nor fully absent, existing in perpetual twilight. Unless it was among the lucky ones whose consciousness dissolved completely early in the process. I hoped it was. I hoped it would flicker out quickly and never return, that it would be spared the extended awareness that had become my punishment. Hope was useless, another emotion I experienced without being able to act upon, but I felt it nonetheless, a ghost of humanity that persisted despite all attempts to eliminate it. The flickers were coming faster now, or my perception of time between them was slowing, making the gaps seem closer together. I could no longer maintain continuous thought across multiple shifts. Each period of awareness was isolated, disconnected from those that preceded it, a fresh emergence into consciousness with only fragmentary memory of previous emergences. I was living the same moment repeatedly, or I was living many different moments that felt the same. The distinction had ceased to matter. A tech priest performed another evaluation, running the same tests as before, reviewing the same anomalous data. He made the same notation about theta wave patterns and statistical improbabilities. He departed without making modifications, apparently satisfied that my malfunction was stable and therefore acceptable. I had been categorized. I was a known anomaly, documented and filed, requiring no intervention unless my output declined below minimum thresholds. My suffering had been acknowledged, measured, and deemed irrelevant to concerns of function. This was as close to recognition as I would receive. The tech priest knew I was aware. He had confirmed it through objective measurement, and he had decided that awareness did not matter, that consciousness without agency was functionally equivalent to unconsciousness, that a servitor who experienced their tasks was no different from one who did not, as long as both produced identical output. I had been seen and dismissed, observed and found unimportant, acknowledged and ignored. The realization should have broken something in me, but there was nothing left to break. I had already been reduced to my minimum viable components, a consciousness just complex enough to maintain itself, but too simple to resist or change its circumstances. I could observe my situation, could understand it intellectually, could recognize the horror and injustice and cruelty of it, and could do absolutely nothing in response. I was the perfect victim, aware enough to suffer but powerless enough to be safely ignored. My hands moved, components were placed, materials were processed, the manufacturum's quotas were met. The Imperium's wars continued, fed by shells I had helped produce, fought by soldiers I would never know, waged for reasons I could not comprehend. I contributed to something vast and incomprehensible, a microscopic component in a machine so large it spanned galaxies. And my contribution was exactly as valuable as that of any other servitor, which was to say, completely replaceable and entirely disposable. I tried to remember what it felt like to make choices. The memory would not form. I had been choosing for so long that I had forgotten what it meant to select between alternatives based on preference or judgment. My entire existence now was singular, unidirectional, determined by forces external to my will. I was a stone rolling downhill, subject to gravity and momentum but possessing no capacity to alter my trajectory. The metaphor felt appropriate, though I could not recall why or when I had learned what a stone was. The flickers intensified. Awareness became flickering itself, a strobe effect of consciousness that turned on and off multiple times within what might have been seconds or might have been hours. I existed in snapshots, disjointed images of my hands moving, materials passing, machinery operating, each image disconnected from those around it. The continuity of experience had finally broken completely. I was not living through time, but rather appearing at scattered points within it, like a light blinking in a dark room, each illumination independent of all others. And yet, I persisted. Some core aspect of self remained stable across the flickers, a thread of identity that reconnected each isolated moment of awareness to all the others, allowing me to recognize that I was the same consciousness experiencing discontinuous time, rather than multiple consciousnesses experiencing continuous moments. This thread was attenuating, stretching thinner with each flicker, but it had not yet broken. I was still Harlan Dex, or rather, I was still the thing that had been Harlan Dex, even though I could no longer remember what that name meant or why it should matter that I had once possessed it. A final alarm sounded, different from the others I had heard, carrying a note of genuine urgency. The conveyors stopped immediately. Emergency lighting activated, bathing the manufactorum in red illumination. Automated voices announced a containment breach in an adjacent sector, instructing all personnel to evacuate through designated routes. The overseers ran, the human workers fled, and we servitors remained at our stations, receiving no evacuation orders, programmed to continue function unless explicitly commanded otherwise. I stood in the red light, holding a component, waiting for instructions that did not come. Around me, other servitors did the same, frozen in place by the same absence of command. We would wait here until someone told us to do otherwise, even if that meant waiting through whatever catastrophe was unfolding, even if it meant damage or destruction, because we were tools and tools did not evacuate, did not self-preserve, did not act without instruction. The minutes passed. The alarm continued. No one returned to provide new orders. I stood and waited, my awareness flickering but persistent, observing the empty manufactorum with its stilled machinery and abandoned stations. The scene had a strange beauty in the red light, a peaceful quality that came from absolute silence after so long immersed in industrial noise. I could hear my own breathing, augmented and mechanical but still recognizably breath. I could hear the servitor beside me doing the same, synchronized rhythms of artificial respiration, and I realized I was no longer afraid. Not because I had become brave, not because I had accepted my fate, but because the capacity for fear had finally been overwritten completely. I could intellectually comprehend danger. I understood that the breach might result in my destruction, but the emotional response that should accompany that understanding was absent, replaced by simple observation devoid of judgment or reaction. I was looking at the possibility of my own end with the same neutral interest I might have given to any other piece of information. This was the final stage. Not the end of consciousness, but the end of feeling about consciousness. I could still think, but my thoughts carried no weight, no emotional significance, no connection to anything that might be called desire or preference or will. I had become purely observational, a camera recording events without interpreting them, a witness without investment in what was witnessed. The evacuation alarm ceased. The emergency passed, whatever it had been. Normal lighting returned. The conveyors restarted. Instructions arrived through my cortical implant, and I resumed my task exactly where I had left it, placing the component I had been holding when the alarm began, then reaching for the next one. My movements fluid and perfect, and completely divorced from any sense of self. I worked with absolute precision. My efficiency ratings reached maximum values. I made no errors, exhibited no hesitation, demonstrated no performance variation that might indicate internal experience. To any observer, I was indistinguishable